Welcome, everyone, to our fourth book club conversation, the Lift Every Voice Book Club. This is our book for May, Four Gifts, this beautiful book, Seeking Self-Care for Heart, Soul, Mind, and Strength by April Yamasaki, who's here with us today. And I'm also joined by Claudia, who's my ongoing partner in these book club conversations. And we're really delighted to be talking today about self-care and all these different dimensions. So I want to introduce April. She's an ordained minister and a speaker, a writer of many articles and books about spiritual growth and Christian living. And she's also the resident author at Valley Crossways Church in British Columbia in Canada. So welcome, April. It's wonderful to have you here with us.
It's an honor. Thank you so much, Christine and Claudia and everyone. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. And I would love to just hear a little bit more about your background and particularly like what in your background prompted you to write this particular book.
Well, at the time I wrote Four Gifts, I was a full-time pastor of a congregation and doing some writing and speaking on the side. And I knew that for myself, self-care was important to sustain all of that. A number of years earlier, my own mother and my husband's parents were all in care homes. They were in three separate care homes
Wow.
about an hour away from where we lived. And it meant that I did a lot of driving back and forth. And with all of that family things happening and ministry things happening and writing on the side, for me, I knew that self-care was essential. But I always thought of it as something that I did on my own time, if there was, ever such a thing as my own time. Getting a good night's sleep, eating healthy, working out, taking a weekend off when I could. Those are all things I thought of as self care, but I did on my own time. But I started reading some articles about self care as part of work, as part of ministry. That was a
Mm.
new idea for me. So I began wrestling with that idea, playing with that idea, wondering about what that might mean for me personally. And I wrote a blog post about it. My editor from Herald Press, who had been the editor on Sacred Pauses, Spiritual Practices for Personal Renewal, we had already been in conversation about what my next book might be with Herald Press, but we hadn't decided on anything. She read that article, and just a few days later, she emailed me and she said, my first thought was that this should be in a book. And so we went from there, thinking about how I might be able to share my journey with self care, some of the ambivalences and questions I had about self care, and offer something that would become Four Gifts, seeking self care for heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Thank you. That's a great yeah, foundation for all that came. um, yeah. Claudia, do you want to start us off with some questions?
Yeah. My first question, April, is with such a frightening rise of violence against Asians, which is not new in this country, how do you take care of yourself and your loved ones in that context?
It's been very difficult to hear about and see what is happening both in the United States and also in Canada. We've seen that same kind of increase in verbal harassment and physical assault against Asians and people of Asian descent. So it's been disturbing, and even though I have not been personally harassed or attacked, it's something that I think about when I go out, and I can understand the level of anxiety, that extra layer that is put on top of just having to deal with the pandemic itself, which we are all needing to deal with. So when I think about self-care in that context, really for me, it's about going back to the basics of heart, soul, mind, and strength, thinking about all of that together, rooted in love for God and love for neighbor and loving ourselves in all of that mix. And I guess for me, some other things that have become important is would be taking a break from the news. As much as I want to be informed and aware of what's going on, and I know I need to be, sometimes I also need to just take a step back and take a break from all of that. And that's one piece of self-care that I don't think I really paid as much attention to before. But with what's happening in the world, that's become more important. And the other thing is, I try to remind myself and remind other people that what we see in this kind of anti-Asian hostility, which was there before in other forms, in some form, as you say, but it appears to be increasing. That with all of that, it's coming out of a place of ignorance and fear. It's not coming out of what anything, I or any particular person from Asia or of Asian descent might have done or is doing, and not something that we need to feel guilty about. And I think that kind of self-talk is also an important piece of self-care that I perhaps didn't pay attention to as much as I do today because of this context.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that concept of the messages that we give ourselves. And also, I think you offer a lot of graciousness to people who are, committing these acts of racism. And, I do believe that there is at the root of that a lot of trauma. And so I think your book actually, addresses that, invites us all into this kind of active self-compassion and self-care that could create, a culture that has perhaps more generosity towards one another ultimately. Um, so I wonder, this the self-care takes an awful lot of humility and vulnerability to allow for oneself, to ask for the time, depending on if you have a family. And I think even though in our church culture, ideally, Jesus, I think, is a model of this kind of vulnerability, but we don't often see that modeled in our church culture. So I wonder, particularly as a pastor, how have you, like, what kind of resistance have you encountered? How do you sort of navigate that? Yeah, that invitation to that kind of radical vulnerability that this path requires.
Well, when it comes to the topic of self-care in general, I haven't found much resistance
Mm-hmm.
from people, mainly for those who have not considered self-care or who might think that self-care is selfish.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly, I find that people respond with a sense of relief that now they have some permission, if they needed permission, to think about themselves and their own needs, and to understand that God loves them so much that they can also love themselves. So there's a sense of a burden being lifted, some
Mm-hmm.
relief. But I find that still we mainly understand self care as self care. It's something that we do or that I must do. So there's that sense of it being self reliant. If I could only do self care right, then I could take care of everyone and everything else, and all will be right with the world. But I think to open that up, to understand self care in what I call a Christ centered way, that's centered on loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. When we understand that it's rooted in the love of God, somehow that helps me, and I hope helps other people to understand our own limits, to understand that it's not about becoming so good at self-care that we can handle everything in our lives, but there is a piece of self-care that is about not being self-reliant, but about casting all of our cares on God. So no matter what kind of good self-talk we practice, no matter how many breaks we try to give ourselves and be kind to ourselves, we come to the limits of our own self-care, and we come to the limits oftentimes of what other people are able to help us with. And that's where, for me, that sense of relying on God who cares for us, take self-care out of just self-care to relying on God's care, which is all sufficient. And you're right, that takes some humility, some vulnerability, and to ground that in who God is and who we are before God, I find helpful to model that, to be able to talk about that in the church, whether in small groups or in pastoral care situations or even in preaching and teaching. Last year, I was contacted by one church who the leadership there said that they wanted to work at this. And so they had decided to have a series in their worship and preaching on 4 gifts. And they took
Mm.
4 Sundays, one Sunday for heart, soul, mind, strength, and they lifted out from scripture and from the book and from their own experience some of those themes. So that was one way that they were trying to open up the conversation around it. Another church contacted me. They had a book study group, and it was actually a kind of a community group with people from different churches. And they also wanted to talk about this. And I hope that could spark some conversations then in their own congregations and to move from there. I once went to a church conference that talked about the pastor's role, particularly the lead pastor's role, which I was in at the time, as the atmospheric architect of the church, the one who sets the tone. And I think there is a sense that pastors or other leaders set the tone in all of that. But I think for each one of us, we can also set the tone in whatever circle we're in our family and household circle, among our friends, if we're in a small group in the church, if we're in a committee in the church. And that will help us then more broadly, not only coming from leadership, but more broadly developing that in our churches.
I love that phrase, atmospheric architect. That's a really fantastic image. And I think because I've worked a lot with ministers in different programs, and I find that oftentimes that like allowing themselves to step out of that role and give themselves some self-care, realizing they don't have to be the pastor to everyone in every moment can be a real challenge. So I think it's a wonderful way of kind of framing it, I think. So thank you for that.
Well, it was interesting to me that after I'd been in my church for 6 years, there was a sabbatical policy on the books that the church had, but they had never had a pastor stay long enough to apply for that. So I applied for that, and our church was very much a congregational church, congregational decision making. And at our church council, when they discussed it, someone said, well, we should take it to the congregation to vote on this because we're a congregational process here. And one of our deacons said, we've already discussed this as a congregation. We agreed that we would have the sabbatical policy, and now is the time for us just to move ahead with this. We'll announce that this is what will be happening, and how then will we move forward with this and plan for the church while I'm away. And I was so thankful for that kind of leadership that, instead of needing to revisit things once again, they were ready to move ahead. And I think that helped to change the culture also.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
April, I want to ask about the sacred pauses. I imagine that you tried different things. So I'm wondering if you tried something that didn't work.
When I wrote Sacred Pauses, the book, and then later referenced it in 4 Gifts, for that I had tried many different pauses from sort of the classical historical Christian practices like prayer and fasting, and maybe some less traditional ones like having fun. And for me, I found value in all of those, but some seem to be more suited to certain seasons. So for me, sometimes reading poetry is a beautiful sacred pause, but sometimes I just feel too restless to sit and read poetry. And for me, it's more of a sacred pause than to go out and go for a walk. And sometimes I find that scripture speaks powerfully to me, and at other times I don't feel the same way. And when that happens, I don't stress about that. I simply say to myself, well, not every meal is as memorable as every other meal, but it nourishes me just the same. And so too with a sacred pause, that God is at work, maybe in ways that I don't feel right now or I don't understand right now. But at least for those moments, that sacred pause took me out of the regular push and pull of daily life. And it provided that space for God to work, even if I don't necessarily feel as refreshed at that moment as I might long for. And so I think there's a sense that while there is refreshment in this life, it is also a taste of what is to come. That we may not feel uh, that sacred pause, that refreshment as fully now as we will one day.
That's really beautiful. It's such a generous offering to yourself, to allow the full spectrum and to know that what works on one day isn't always going to work, but also to trust that God's grace is there in the midst. That's really beautiful. Um, I wanted to ask you about the practice of lament because I was so happy to see it included in the book, because for me it feels like such an essential practice. And if you can maybe talk a little bit about how you see that as a self-care practice, and particularly in this time of pandemic, what role might that play for people to help give them a place to express their grief and their sorrow.
I find that in times of stress, for me, it just automatically becomes a time for lament, or maybe I would say rather complaint. Hasn't quite reached the level of lament, but that sense of this is what's happened, this is awful. I am sad about it, I am suffering over it, I am angry about it, and I just want to express that. In the book I talk about eating from our sad food group, or other ways of expressing what is happening to us and what we see around us. And for some time, I think I saw lament as very personal about what was happening to me. But and I see that in scripture too. The psalmist who is crying out to God alone at night, that very personal and expression that comes from the inside out. And yet, in scripture, particularly in the Psalms, I see that lament is not only personal and private, but it becomes part of public worship. And it names what is happening. It names the injustice, it names the oppression, it expresses all of those emotions and the pain around it. It calls on God, and it bears witness to the community. So it becomes something more than my personal lament, but it becomes part of a community lament. And that's where I think partly self care and community care work together. And perhaps I haven't really lamented fully if it is only in the privacy of my own heart, that somehow lament for its full expression needs to have that witness and that community of other people, and it needs to be directed toward God, and it needs to be that witness to the wider world. And so all of that, I think, is part of um, self care and part of community care and part of witness in the world.
Yeah, I really loved how you connected self-care and community care. And particularly when you were talking earlier about how self-care can become this self-reliant thing. It can be sort of one more thing that we need to kind of do for ourselves. But that extension of grace and leaning into one another. And you talked about Sabbath in kind of similar terms. And a Sabbath, I think, would be the other, in addition to lament, would be probably my other top required personal practice, but also one that really relies on a community, I think, of care as well.
In the Black community, we saw last summer this huge uprising around Black Lives Matter. And I was wondering if you could speak to channeling lament into seeking positive change. The Black community is constantly under attack, so we never get a break from slavery till now. So, what could you say to a community, like I said, that's always under attack, and the positive changes are very slow going, if they're going anywhere at all?
Yeah, I think that's where I need to learn from you and from others who are working and living in that context most deeply and most nearly. Um, so I think that's one piece that we learn from one another, and I think there is something about our interaction that that helps us with that. There's a line in Proverbs, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And I think that that's what we need. That for some of us who are more removed from being directly affected by some of these things, our senses have become dulled to much of what is happening. We are not aware of what is happening, or we don't understand why it is significant, and we need to learn. So that might be one thing. And I think lament has a place in that as a witness, because it raises awareness and it calls for action. And I think that's where, for me, when I say, "Oh, well, yeah, I'm just complaining about this," but to understand lament biblically, it's not only just complaining about it to myself. It is also that um, community aspect. It's that working together, holding one another up, calling on others to bear witness and to be part of that, and calling on God for action. I see in the New Testament, in the teaching of Jesus, he has that story about the persistent widow who keeps on going back to the judge again and again and again. And he commends her for that. And in the story, she eventually gets the justice that she's seeking after, not through any sense of justice on the part of the judge necessarily, but because he's so tired of this persistence. And I would hesitate to say to any community, well, just persist, just endure, because you know that within the community already, that long history and that long endurance. And so, who am I, or who is anyone, who are we to say, keep on keeping on? And yet, that seems to be what is required, as long as the injustice has not been rectified, as long as there isn't healing and peace that we long for. We keep seeking after it. And I think for me, that's one of the reasons in the subtitle for Four Gifts, I wanted to say it's seeking self-care for heart, soul, mind, and strength, because we don't necessarily achieve that perfection of self-care, just as we don't achieve um, the justice and the peace that we are looking for, but we keep at it, because that is the journey that is placed before us. And if we can find allies along the way, if we can find friends along the way, if we can find people who can support one another in this, that also contributes to our health, our own self-care, and it widens the community care as well.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. Always going back to the community, and it makes me think of I don't know if you're familiar with Tricia Hersey's work, the NAP Ministry. She's a Black woman, and I think she went to seminary in Atlanta. And anyway, she's kind of a like a chaplain, pastor, performance artist, and she does these beautiful art projects where she has images of herself napping, but in like fields of cotton, kind of as a remembrance of her ancestors and how her ancestors could never rest. And so she really explores this idea of rest and nap, and she creates public spaces where people can come, obviously not in pandemic times, but where people can come and simply just nap and just simply rest, and kind of creating that culture. So I think it's a beautiful way of, I think what I love about her work is kind of getting to the heart of how this self-care and how we work to allow others to have that that gift as well as part of it. Do you know what I mean? Is integral. Obviously, some people have, to work endless hours, and how do we make sure that everybody has access to that kind of generosity of rest? And I think sleep, and that is probably the other of the three self-care practices that I would consider to be the most important. Yeah. I wanted to talk about, I wanted to actually go back to the beginning of the book, because you talk about your core commitments and how that sort of forms a foundation of self-care. And I really loved that term, because I think right now I'm sort of in my own discernment, or I think I've taken on a little too much in this season right now in my life. And I've been thinking about what are the essential things, which I think is very similar to the core commitments. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you understand what these core commitments are, and how somebody goes about maybe listening for what are those kind of core principles that help somebody to discern, what is most important for them.
Listen to your life, listen to God, talk to people who can help you process all of that. I think sometimes in some seasons of life, it's quite obvious what our core commitments are. So in my own life, my husband has recently been diagnosed with cancer and is going through treatment. And for me, one of my core commitments then is to walk with him on this journey, to love him and to see that he gets the best care possible. And to do that, to see that as one of my core commitments has meant letting some other things go. So I had been working on a book project, but I said to my publisher, in light of this new diagnosis, and it's been overwhelming personally, and it's been very demanding time-wise, with multiple appointments every week, and just dealing with a lot of things that we hadn't had to before. I need to set aside this book. I need to set aside some other things, and there are some things that I have kept because it's good to have some normalcy in our lives as well. And my husband has encouraged me to keep on with some of my speaking and my writing. But for me, I would say, it's so obvious that in this time of transition, this is what needs to happen. At other times when it's not so obvious, or when you're already feeling overwhelmed, or it is a time of transition and there's a sense that things are changing, for me, it's been helpful to listen to my life and listen to God by journaling, by spending time in reflection and in prayer, and by talking with other people. When I was first called into pastoral ministry, it was not something that I had sought, but something that came out of some of the volunteer commitments I had made. And then I was called into pastoral ministry. I remember at the time I talked with different people that I knew that were trusted, just in a confidential way, to test whether this was a new direction for me. And I remember at one point my sister said to me, "Well, how can you call it confidential when you're talking to all of these people?" And in one way, like I didn't want to go around and talk about it publicly, but for me, it was very important to process that with other people and not just to rely on myself, because maybe I wasn't hearing things the way I needed to hear them. And maybe there were some things in my own background that made it difficult for me to hear certain things. So I find that helpful, and perhaps for others that are needing to discern, Those would be the three things: listening to just what's happening in your own life, in your own heart, listen to God, and listen carefully with other people.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
One of my sons has a pretty severe mental illness, and I myself have a mental illness. There were times that I was told about myself and my son that we needed, prayer. We didn't need medication, that we needed deliverance, especially for my son. uh, and it was implied that he had demons instead of mental illness. So you say that self care could include counseling, medication, outpatient care, hospital care, and other therapies. But what would you say to a person that was actually shamed in their churches for having these kind of issues and for needing medication instead of deliverance?
I'm sorry to hear that. And while I love and respect the church, I hate to say, well, maybe you need a new church community, but unfortunately, that sometimes is the sad reality. That just as much as we love and respect the church, congregations also have their blind spots. They have their places where they're not really able to speak into what's happening for someone else. So the church is much bigger than any one local congregation. Um, and I think we need a faith community. I need a faith community, but sometimes it means discerning what that community, who that community will be. So that might be one thing. And I think for churches to um, grow in their capacity for caring for all people. And it is uh, perhaps easiest for churches to make assumptions and to care in the particular ways that they have been used to caring for people. And yes, people with mental illness and people without mental illness, we all need prayer. I can't argue with that, but we also often need more. And rather than seeing counseling or medication as things that are outside of the church or outside of faith, I think we can see them as things that God uses. Um,
Mm.
God uses prayer. God uses people to come around us and support us. God can use that counseling and that medication. And to think about our self care and our mental and physical well being in a holistic way and not in a reductionist way, as if, well, you only need prayer. Well, we need more than that. In British Columbia, where I live, our public health officials have been working very hard to address COVID and how we are dealing with this pandemic. But one of the things that they did was they put out a little chart. It was a self-care chart, self-care bingo with little squares with different things that you could do, like reading a book or going for a walk. And while those kinds of self-care things are not bad, there was a real public reaction against it, as if you're the public officials who are responsible for dealing with this pandemic. We need more than this kind of personal self-care. Where is the support for people who are having trouble having a roof over their heads because they've lost their job in this pandemic? Where is the assistance that we need in having enough personal protection equipment available for workers? So not everything can be addressed just by individual self-care or just by prayer or just by whatever it is. And I think that applies to dealing with the pandemic and applies also to dealing with mental health issues.
Yeah.
I have a godmother who takes a psych medication. And she told me once that taking medication is an act of humility because you are acknowledging, well, I have this need and I need to address it, not just spiritually, but humbly take the medication.
Mm. That's beautiful.
Yeah, that is beautiful, and it's very true. It does take a kind of humility to be able to do that, and yet we are human. We need to be that humble.
Hmm. One of my favorite quotes in your book is this question towards the end. It says, "What would it look like for you to care for yourself and others out of God's strength instead of relying solely on your own strength?" Which, or to serve out God's abundance instead of scarcity. And I loved that question because I feel like that's something I still have to remind myself of sometimes. I think I was raised to be such a self-reliant person that even as someone who believes so much in, contemplative practice and slowing down and obviously, having God's grace to hold that. What are the ways that you help to encourage people to soften into that grace? I love, because I think what I love about this book is that it's not just self-care, it is communal care, but it's also God care. Like it's all of those things woven together. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
I think with that question, and actually with many of the questions that are throughout for gifts, it's almost like the question is more important than what is the answer, and it's the wrestling with those questions, the dreaming with those questions that is something we each need to do, because the answers, the way that we live this out will be different given our context, given our personality, given who we are. So I think that's what I would mainly focus on. And sometimes when people say, "Oh, I'm so overwhelmed and I don't know what I'm going to do," sometimes rather than saying to them, "Okay, well, this and this and this, those things, they should be out," what would be more helpful is simply to ask that question. Well, are there some things that you feel like you're doing more out of your own sense of obligation than really what God has placed before you? Is it
Mm.
something that belongs to someone else or somewhere else? And sometimes just asking those questions can help people reflect and to find the answers or realize the answers themselves. Long ago, I read a book on counseling, and one of the author said that often when she was counseling people, she would find that actually their bodies already knew the answer, because
Mm.
they would tighten up over something, and their bodies were trying to tell them something, but they hadn't, it just hadn't risen to the level of their conscious mind. Okay,
Mm.
yeah, every time I think about this, I just feel stressed out over it. Well, maybe your body is trying to tell you that that's something you're doing out of your own strength, or that's something that you need to lay aside, or is it saying that's something that you need to rise to? So I think we need to reflect on those questions and really discover what are our lives telling us, what is God telling us.
Yeah, I love that idea of, does this belong to me? Am I carrying something that doesn't belong to me? And how might I ask for support in carrying that or setting it aside? Yeah, I think that's beautiful. It's a beautiful image that weaves together that self, community, and God that you so beautifully weave together in your book.
I
Mm.
want to ask, you talked about the pandemic and the things that we can expect or that we want from leadership, but how do we take care of ourselves in a personal way? What are some practical things that we can do to help us in this pandemic? How do we take care of ourselves?
For me, it's whether it's a time of pandemic or a time of peace, those basics are important: to love God, love neighbor, care for ourselves, heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then I think in particular situations, what is it that disturbs us? What is it that tells us we need a specific type of self care? So for myself, um, one of the things that I found with the pandemic and being at home in a way that I hadn't needed to be at home quite so much, I started losing a sense of what day of the week is it? Where are we in the week? Is it Saturday? Is it Monday? Moving so much of life online and being able to connect with people, as in this case, around the world, but it skews then the time and the things that I might have used to do as part of my workday in my morning time or my afternoon. Now I'm doing it 7 o'clock in the morning because I need to match up with someone else's time zone. So that really felt disorienting to me. And I thought I need more things than just my Sunday morning Zoom worship. I need something more than that to help give definition to my week. And one of the things I did, just, kind of on a whim, I made homemade pizza, and I made it a second week in a row. And that became kind of the defining thing. Friday, afternoon, evening, I make up the dough, we bake it up on Saturday, and that helped to form um, more of a weekend for me and for my husband and I. And so that was one practical way of self-care that was helpful to say, okay, I need more definition to time, to my week, and what would help me do that. Early on in the pandemic, I was also very conscious about getting outside every day. I wasn't naturally going outside, off to my church office or out to meet someone. And so I began deliberately saying, okay, every day I'm going to spend part of the day outside. I might go for a walk, I might just put around in the garden, but I'm going to do something. Well, as time has gone on, that has kind of dropped away for me. And I'm at the point now, and maybe it's because it's spring and the weather is starting to be so beautiful here too, that I'm saying, yeah, what happened to that? I used to do that. It kind of fell off the table. And now I want to do that again, to be more deliberate about being outside, because that's an important piece of self-care during this pandemic.
Mm.
And for other people, it might be something else that they need to do deliberately. It might be deliberately calling someone every day or every week in order to reach out and to have more connection with other people, or it might be something else.
Mm. I love that there's a seasonal rhythm to self-care, that there is a season, where you would be naturally more inclined to go outside and then maybe retreat and then ask yourself that question again, when how might I reclaim this? I wonder if you have any other growing edges right now around your own self-care practice, or I imagine some of it has a lot to do probably with your husband's health and navigating all of that, but is there any area that you feel are particularly kind of calling to you as this growing edge?
Well, I think the other growing edge for me, besides wanting to be outside more, and maybe this is related, but the whole idea of a social media Sabbath.
Mm.
Before the pandemic, I had developed that, Saturday night, 6 o'clock to Sunday night, 6 o'clock, I will take that social media Sabbath. And then I switched from being a congregational pastor now to being a resident author, focusing more specifically on writing and speaking. And I took on some roles that involved social media on Sunday mornings. And I still said to myself, okay, I'm still taking a Sabbath, but I'm making an exception for these specific things. Well, with the pandemic, more of life has been pushed online, and I have made more exceptions. And, at what point, I've been asking myself, at what point do all of these exceptions mean you're no longer taking a social media Sabbath? It's really become a time like any other time of the week. And do I need to have a specific social media Sabbath in that way? A weekly kind of a 24-hour period? What do I need? Because I did find that to be quite refreshing, to step away from the sort of always on relentlessness of the online world. And now it's different. is that a good thing? Is it a not so healthy thing for me? So that for me is a growing edge, still to figure that out.
Yeah, I find for me that that's one of the key parts of a Sabbath practice is to have that disengagement from technology for even a few hours is incredibly refreshing. And maybe, yeah, something that people in this pandemic time might take to heart as well. Just that I don't think people realize how much that online engagement all the time can really impact us and exhaust us. Of course, Zoom fatigue being, a new term. Well, thank you, April. This has been really wonderful conversation. Claudia, is there anything else you wanted to ask, or is that
I just
feel
want
like
to
a good?
thank you for being with us. It was
Yeah,
a great conversation. We
yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah, and I always listen to the video after we done recording it, so I'm really looking forward to listening again just for myself. And yeah, thank you so much for your generosity of being with us and sharing with our participants. It's really a wonderful gift to get to know you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a gift for me to be able to meet you both this way. And I wish you well with the book discussion, the book study that's coming up, and in your ministries as you continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.